Hello, thank you for joining us here today for today's webinar on the financial impact of MACRA and how to plan for it. This is Anand Krishnaswamy from Kaufman Hall, and I am joined here today by my colleagues Chelsea Glenn, Nora Kelly, and Jason O'Riordan. And we are part of a deep team of physician strategy and value-based experts with Kaufman Hall, and we are helping organizations, physician organizations, health systems, and hospitals throughout the country prepare and help them execute on the evolving care models and payment models related to Medicare and more broadly across the spectrum as well. Before we get into the presentation today, I wanted to quickly review a few housekeeping items. Whether you're listening on your computer or through the phone line, all attendees will be in a listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. Those participating through their computer can have the ability to send questions through our questions pane that you'll see on your attendee interface. Simply type in your question and click send, and we'll be able to see it on our side. At the end of the presentation, we will answer as many questions as we have time for. But if your question is not addressed during the Q&A, we will be sure to follow up with you afterwards. Please note that the materials related to the presentation today will be accessible within the handouts area of the attendee interface. And as a final note today, the webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive an email link within 24 hours to view the recording. Any of your colleagues who are registered for the webinar but were not able to attend will also receive that link. So with that, we'll get started here today. So this is the third part of our three-part series focused on MACRA. We first started in early November by introducing the final rule and the key components of that rule and what CMS had announced as final at that time. At the end of November, we then focused on helping you develop your MACRA strategy and understanding what those key strategic components and capabilities needed would be, as well as talking about the strategic paths and options that would be available to your organization. Today's focus will be on the financial impact of MACRA and how to plan for it. So this will include a couple of elements. Today we'll talk about the direct revenue impacts of MACRA, talking about what investments will be needed to support those capabilities and competencies and strategies that we introduced at the last webinar, and also talking about the implications and the risks associated with the transition to value-based care under MACRA. So today we'll start to really help you develop an approach to model and understand the impacts of MACRA on your particular organization. From our perspective, what we think is clear is that the risks of failure or the risks of a do-nothing strategy associated with MACRA are just too big. And we really encourage organizations to develop the strategy for success for your physician organization and ultimately for your community. And importantly, as you develop that strategy, we really think it's critical to have a clear understanding of what that financial impact of that strategy or strategies will be, and integrating that into developing and identifying the best path for your organization. So with that context in mind, as you think about the strategy and the financial impacts, I want to turn it over to our first presenter here today, Chelsea Glenn.
Sure. So we are going to talk today about the two main tracks of MACRA, MIPS and advanced APM. We're going to start off with the MIPS track, as the majority of providers fall within MIPS, at least for the first few years of MACRA. As you see here, there is a scaled revenue impact over time with a ramp up from 2017 on. And to note, 2017 is actually a transition year, so the majority of providers are expected to avoid negative penalty. CMS estimates about 95% of providers will be able to avoid penalty in 2017. This is really to try and help them get used to the MACRA program without receiving big penalties that first year. And then just as a note, you'll see two types of references to years in the presentation. Performance year is the year that you're being measured. So 2017, this year, is the first year of performance measurement. Payment will not be received till 2 years later, so that corresponds to that 2019 payment year. So starting with that MIPS category, there are 4 main factors that will affect the MIPS bonus and penalty. 1 is relative performance to MIPS peers. 2 is APM eligibility. 3 is the exceptional performance bonus. And 4 is the budget neutrality factor. Now within MIPS, there's 2 main tracks. There's kind of the general population of individuals and groups filing under MIPS. And then there's the MIPS APM category. MIPS APMs are APM models that don't reach that advanced APM threshold to qualify for the second MACRA track. This usually means that they're only taking on a little bit of downside risk or upside only. So that's like MSSP track 1, for instance. MIPS APMs do receive preferential scoring under MIPS, a series of bonus points, as well as not being scored on resource use or cost. This is advantageous for them because once they receive a composite score, they're then compared with the general population of individuals and groups who are filing in order to be given that penalty or bonus scheme. So because MIPS is budget neutral, CMS expects to distribute as many penalties as it does bonuses, so it balances out. So that's where that budget neutrality factor will kick in. CMS expects to assign a bonus multiplier of 0 to 3 times in order to balance that bonus level received with the penalties that they're distributing. And then that final piece, that exceptional performance bonus, we'll look at in our scenario builders that we're going to go through. That is, if you're a really high performer, there is an extra pool of bonus that you can receive up to additional 10% of your Part B revenue to reward you for being such a high performer under the program. Next slide. So today we're going to look at 3 different scenarios. And we actually have a MIPS financial calculator online, and you can put in your own scores and look at how that will affect your revenue stream over time. So the 3 scenarios we're going to look at are a penalized performer who's performing well below that bonus penalty threshold, an average performer who's performing near the threshold amount, and then a high performer. Now MIPS is composed of 4 different categories: quality, resource use or cost, advancing care information, which is what replaces meaningful use, and clinical practice improvement activities. And that's that new category that focuses on population health management, care coordination, et cetera. So what we're going to do in order to present these financial scenarios is we've assigned 3 sets of scores depending on the penalized, average, or high performer scenario, and we keep those scores fixed over time because we want you to be able to see how the changes in the weightings of the 4 categories within MIPS affects your revenue over time. And so we also keep the budget neutrality factor set at 1 just to not complicate things. And the threshold between receiving a penalty and receiving a bonus is 60 out of 100. And that's the score that CMS also uses in its scenarios that it does in its final rule. So we just kept it at that for consistency. Now, as you'll see, we exclude 2017 performance year, 2019 payment year, because this is such a strange year and it's transitional, and most people will avoid penalties, so that we expect kind of a dampening factor on that bonus. So we're not going to model that because it's such a strange year. Go to the next slide. So looking at our penalized performer first, you'll see we've given them a quality score of 40%. Resource use or cost at 20%, ACI, which is advancing care information, at 20%, and clinical practice improvement activities at 15%. Now, as a really important note, I mentioned MIPS APMs receive preferential scoring. This is a really great demonstration of that. So they're not scored on resource use at all. And for the clinical practice improvement activities, the way that's scored for MIPS APMs is really unique. First of all, there's a floor of 50%. They automatically get that. Then CMS will look at the charter of the APM and decide how many automatic points that APM should be receiving. If the APM doesn't hit 100%, then it can self-submit more evidence to boost its score. So that's really useful in this case, and that's incorporated in this model. And you'll see that big gap between the light blue line, which is MIPS APMs, and the dark blue line, which is the MIPS standalone. And that's one of the main reasons for that is, first of all, they're not getting penalized for that really low resource use score. And then second, they're at 50% CPIA automatically. So now just to kind of explain that big dip you see in a penalty increase, that's caused by two things. First of all, the weight of quality in the MIPS score decreases over time. So quality is the majority of the score in the early years. And then by 2019, it actually equals resource use for the general MIPS population. They're both weighted at 30%. And this is really going to cause a change in the way providers think about giving out care. They really need to start incorporating that efficiency and that cost consciousness. And then if you see as well, when we presented that timeline of bonuses and penalties, your potential for receiving penalty increases from 2017 at -4 maximum to -9% by 2020. So that's also impacting your score negatively as a poor performer. If we go into the next one. So this is your average performer, quality at 75%, which is above that 60% threshold between bonus and penalty. Resource use, ACI are both at the threshold at 60, and then CPIA is at 65. And we vary these scores a little bit just so we can show you within the graph what the impacts will be. So as you see, between 2018 and 2019, there's that little dip. And that, again, is because quality is being weighted less. And then that increase that you see between 2019 and 2020, this is actually caused by the flip side of what I was talking about in the poor performer. This is caused by the fact that the maximum bonus you can receive increases from +4 to +9% between 2017 and 2020. So if your score stays the same, if everyone's score stays the same as in this modeling assumption, that means you'll actually be receiving a revenue boost over time simply because the range of possible scores has increased over time. And then if we go to the final scenario. So the high performer, as you can see in the early years of MIPS, there is a large revenue bonus caused by this exceptional performance bonus. Now the exceptional performance bonus is scheduled to end in 2020. And this can give you up to 10% extra on top of what you're receiving. So on top of that 9%, another 10% bonus in Part B revenue. However, as a note, it is subject to a dampening multiplier. So CMS can multiply this, your 10% by 0.5 or 0.1 in order to make sure that they're not spending above their 500 million pool cap each year. So with our high performer, you can see that quality is at 90%, resource use at 70, ACI at 70, and CPIA at 75. And so this person is receiving almost the entirety of that bonus score over time. Now again, that 2018 to 2019 dip is because quality weighting goes down, and then that increase between 2019 and 2020 is the increase in score magnitude as MIPS bonuses ramp up over time. And again, I'd like to remind you that you can visit our calculator online at kaufmanhall.com/MACRA in order to model out your own scenarios. You can put in your own scores, see how that will impact your revenue over time. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jason, who will talk more about advanced APM revenue considerations.
Great. Well, thanks, Chelsea. So when we talk about advanced APMs, a lot of people start with the 5% bonus that Chelsea had on her chart that she started with. And there's a lot of appeal there, obviously. You get a fixed 5% and avoid all the vagaries and uncertainties that Chelsea walked you through. However, I think clearly the modeling to do it right needs to start at that 5% bonus and not stop there. And where you go really depends entirely on which advanced APMs you're evaluating. And when we talked to you last time, we gave you an overview of those models, and we warned you that this would be a dynamic list. And sure enough, the list has changed since we spoke about it last during our last webinar. What you're seeing now is the list that's live as of the 2017 performance period. And a lot of it will look familiar, but the new item to call out is number 8 on the left-hand side, and that's CJR. On the 20th of December, CMS published a final rule related to episode payment. And one of the things that they did in that rule is what they telegraphed previously, which is that they'd be tweaking CJR by adding an EHR element to make sure that track 1 could actually qualify as an advanced APM, and they did do that. So as of today, in 2017, those of you who are participating in CJR in track 1 are actually going to qualify as an advanced APM given the update to this list. So again, really important to continue monitoring this list going forward as you evaluate which advanced APMs are really in play and feasible for your organizations to consider. And as you consider that forward-looking view, CMS has already telegraphed some of what's coming down the pike. Now, again, we know there's some uncertainty here, and this could shift, but we do know some things in the immediate term. If you look at the far left-hand side of the slide, that's another area that was updated with this final episode payment rule that was issued on the 20th of December. And those 3 items were each addressed. The new Track 1 Plus model was reaffirmed for going live in 2018. They put a little more meat on the bone there, sharing some parameters around likely shared savings rates and loss rates. There's a lot of detail still to come that will be shared. But as of now, they did recommit to that Track 1 Plus model to offer folks an advanced APM path with a little less risk. And I mentioned that episode payment model and mentioned CJR in particular for 2017. For 2018, what they're calling the EPM model is actually going to be eligible for folks, for those who are in, again, the track that's eligible for the downside risk. And for those of you who don't know, that's the model that includes some of the cardiac-related bundles. And so that's the new model that was recently finalized again on the 20th of December. They also mentioned at the time that they continue to plan on a new voluntary bundle payment model that's going to replace BPCI. As many of you know, BPCI is not eligible as an advanced APM. So they did say that in the works was going to be a new model, but obviously there's some uncertainty there as the new administration takes hold in DC. So the point is bundle payments were clearly on the radar, and they did finalize regulations that they're planning to do in previous discussions. Now, what you see in the middle and right-hand side of the slide is largely unchanged, but the key point being is that non-Medicare models starting in 2019 are going to be able to contribute to advanced APM eligibility. So it's really important to evaluate that with a long-term view as you consider whether advanced APM paths are right for your organization. So given the array of models, the question is, what do we do with that, and how do we model that? And as you saw from the wide array of models, we could literally spend the next 3 hours looking at every different model and looking at scores of different scenarios. And we didn't think that would be a good use of your time. So rather than do that, what we thought we'd do is pick a few of the models that we get the most questions about and have done really the most work with clients on as a result of client interest, and then show how those would look using a case example that's based on some work that we did for one of our clients. And so that's what you can see here on the slide before you. So let me spend a little time on this to really tee this up. So first, the models that we chose to look at were really the 4 usual suspects: MSSP Track 2, Track 3 of MSSP, and then the 2 versions of the next-gen ACO. The 80 is the 80% sharing version, and then the 100 is the 100% sharing version. And for those 4 models to illustrate the potential impacts, what we did was use this case example that I mentioned. Now we've tweaked a few variables to protect the sensitivity of the information. But we do still think it's reflective of a case that will show you what kinds of impacts could occur as you look at different performance scenarios. So this case institution is a system that has a large employed physician base, about 500 employed docs. They have Part B revenue of roughly $46 million. And when they looked at the assigned beneficiaries that would be assigned to them for Medicare under some of these population health models that I just mentioned, it was roughly 30,000. And taking the rough spend per life, that led to a roughly $300 million benchmark. So that's the case example. Those are the 4 models that we're going to apply to that case. And the key question when you do this sort of modeling is, well, what scenarios do we want to look at? What could occur? And luckily, we actually have a pretty good data set available based on real-life experience from MSSP ACO participants that gives us a flavor for that. And that's what we use to populate the rows on the table at the bottom of the slide. So you see MSSP performance percentiles. What we did was we looked at the roughly 400 organizations where CMS has published performance data from ACOs, and we cut it into percentiles to show the range of performance for those ACOs. So for example, in the percent savings loss column, you see that the 90th percentile, so those that were doing really well in the top 10%, you're at roughly 8.4% savings relative to their benchmark. So if their benchmark was 100, they saved roughly 8% versus that, so they actually had performance of roughly $92 million if their benchmark was 100. On the other end of the spectrum, you see a pretty wide range. The bottom 10th percentile was minus 5.6%. So again, using round, easy numbers, if the benchmark is 100 million, they're actually closer to 106 million in performance for a minus 5.6 delta versus the benchmark. And you can see the percentiles in between. And so what we did was we took those different percentiles and then we ran them through these different tracks using our advanced APM calculator and used this case example to show you with real dollars and get away from all these abstract stop loss and MLRs and maximum loss rates and put it into real dollars for you so you can see what actually happens with absolute dollars. And what jumps out at you obviously is the scale. We're using a large organization here, so that shouldn't be too surprising. But even with that large organization, you can see that on the extremes of potential performance, there's a pretty wide range here. On the very top right, for example, the very top performer, if they go all in with next-gen ACOs, you can see it's roughly 18 million we're talking about in a shared savings type of payment to the ACO. On the other end of this extreme, obviously, if you're to go even beneath that 10 percentile down to a maximum loss situation, you can see that same next-gen ACO is looking at roughly $44 million payment to CMS. Now, clearly that's a very large number, and with significant downside risk models like this, what most clients are doing is using stop-loss insurance and other risk mitigating factors to make sure that that's not the check that needs to be written. But it's important to understand the economics before you layer in those sorts of insurance measures you can take, just to understand how these models could work for your organization. So clearly, key takeaway, a lot of dollars in play, and it's important to compare that with the 5% bonus. So you can see at the bottom of the slide, $2.3 million. When you take 5% of the Part B revenue of $46 million, that's roughly what you get. And so the other key takeaway here is we really need to look well beyond that 5% bonus to understand the impacts to our organization of what some of these advanced APM models could mean. Because typically speaking, the shared savings or shared loss payments that you could incur are really going to dwarf that Part B bonus. So if you only look at that bonus, you're really not looking nearly comprehensively enough. So that's the overview of the advanced APMs. In the context of MACRA strategy, it's really important to put that alongside your alternative, which is MIPS, right? So part of what many organizations are wrestling with is, do they stick with that MIPS track that most people are on? Or do they, take the plunge and consider one of these advanced APMs and take that underlying risk? So what really needs to be done, in addition to considering some of the capability investments that Nora's going to talk about and our overall readiness, is, again, just running the numbers and showing MIPS alongside advanced APMs. And so what you see here is that same case where we show a few different scenarios to really illustrate that. Now, again, operative word here is illustrative. You really do need to run these numbers for your own organization to see what your numbers and the size of your organization, what the implications are. But we do think this illustrates a few high-level takeaways that are generally universal that are important to understand. But first, as far as how we did it, sticking with the advanced APMs on the right, you see those same 4 tracks we just ran you through. And if you tie the numbers here to the previous slide, what you'll notice is that we took the 5% bonus and combined it with those different performance levels. And to define a high performer, average, or penalized, we took the 75th, 50th, and 25th percentiles from that MSSP data set that we just talked about. So that's the advanced APM side. On the MIPS side, we used the numbers that Chelsea walked you through, those percentage values, and we went out to 2020 so you can see once MIPS ramps up, how big the impact could be. And we used those same high, average, and penalized performance scenarios that she walked you through. And then we added a maximum loss at that 9% just so you could see that bookend or floor to compare it apples to the advanced APMs. And clearly that greater risk-reward profile for advanced APMs really just jumps off the slide. As you look at that high performer and track your eye from left to right, clearly the numbers are typically larger for the advanced APM, about $3 million for the MIP side, and you're looking at roughly $5 to $9 million for those advanced APMs. And then similarly on the penalized performer side, generally you're talking about bigger numbers, but not always. And that's why it's important to dig into the nuance where you see, for example, the track 2 and track 3 actually has numbers that aren't quite as big as MIPS based on the definition of that scenario. And in a maximum downside, clearly everybody knows that MIPS puts a cap that's much smaller than the potential downside of the advanced APMs. But you have to run the numbers to see, well, what is the order of magnitude, recognizing again that on the advanced APM side, typically you're adding stop loss to mitigate that as an organization. So that risk-reward profile is really important to understand, but it's also important to understand, too, that MIPS is no free lunch. So by the time you get to 2020, if this organization will hypothetically try to play it safe, you can see that that 9% loss translates to real dollars. So regardless of whether folks are staying on the MIPS path or going down the advanced APM path, it's really important to make investments in capabilities to succeed regardless of the path that you're going down. So that's an overview of the modeling. I'll come back later in the presentation to talk through some other financial considerations to report all together. But critically, the next key thing that needs to be understood is those investments. And to do that, Nora's going to walk us through some of those investments to prepare for value-based care.
Great, thank you, Jason. So up until this point, a lot of the energy around macro modeling has gone into the revenue modeling that Chelsea and Jason have just walked us through, and rightfully so. We did think it was important to spend at least a little bit of time on the types of strategic investments that will be important in order to support that revenue performance. We bucket those investments into two broad categories that you see here. The first would be investments in aligned provider networks, and the second is support services to support those networks, particularly in value-based care environments. None of this is new. Both of these buckets are things we've all been thinking about for quite some time. What's old and new again, what's old is new again, but worth revisiting in the context of MACRA to talk a little bit about how it fits in and what we're seeing. So advancing to the next slide, touching first on investments in provider networks, we think a pluralistic approach is important. This isn't just about employment. And so we think it's important to think about investments both across the continuum of care and across the continuum of alignment options. So across the continuum of care, obviously thinking about everything from the outpatient professional environment all the way to the post-acute environment goes without saying, particularly important for those organizations thinking about APM tracks and other full risk type models. Across the continuum of alignment, you'll want to think about various provider network subgroups, so as we show those in the boxes on the bottom. So again, certainly you'll want to think about your employed providers, but it's not just about employment. You also want to think about your affiliated networks, through IPAs and other models, and your independent medical staff. Some of those providers in the affiliate and independent boxes may choose to move to the left in response to that. We are seeing some of that, but many of them may choose to stay in the models where they are currently, so long as there is sufficient support and services and capabilities available to them to support them through the MACRA transition. And then the other box to think about that isn't shown here would be other independent physicians or small medical practices in your markets that aren't currently aligned but may come looking for support and services or even a new home in response to MACRA. We are hearing providers thinking a lot about this and what this means for them and whether partnerships or alignments are required for future success. And so that may provide some strategic growth opportunities and also some opportunities to meet network requirements, again, if you're thinking about APM tracks or other full risk type models. Moving to the next slide, so thinking about the potential costs of alignment or investments in your provider networks. So again, this is not one size fits all. It's not just about employment. We're continuing to see models across that degree of integration, everything from the low integration options to the left to the high acquisition and employment alignment type options on the right. What we would note on the low integration options is that they're still out there and they're still viable options for a lot of providers. They too tend to be less sticky. Those relationships are generally as strong as the contracts. So as you put those types of models in place, you will just want to think about the cost of those models and balancing those against the risk of potential unwind or disruption, possibly even in the foreseeable future. But again, still seeing a lot of activity here, and the models continue to be very viable. On the right of the spectrum, we are seeing an uptick again in activity around physician acquisition and employment. A lot of physicians, and uniquely some large independent multi-specialty and single specialty practices thinking about strategic partnership today in a way they haven't necessarily wanted to in the past. There's a wide variety of reasons for that. We do hear MACRA cited as one of the reasons for thinking about partnership, although by no means not the only reason. In terms of the costs for these types of models, what that costs you, the answer is it will depend. There are a lot of factors that will impact that cost. The biggest of them obviously being the type of model, so whether you're to the left or to the right of that spectrum will impact the cost. There's a bucket of factors around the specifics of the individual physician or physician practice. So their panel of practice size, their performance, their quality metrics, things like that will influence the cost. And lastly, regional market dynamics. So physician supply and demand, a degree of consolidation, payer dynamics in the model, presence of managed care, all of those things may impact the cost as well. So difficult to provide good benchmarks across the spectrum. We have shown here some illustrated ranges of potential investment requirements per physician for the two bookends here for IT connectivity and then for acquisition and employment on the right. With acquisition and employment, the costs vary on a per physician basis or per provider basis very widely based on the size of the practice. You know, small practices that are largely fixed asset acquisitions are much lower in cost. Again, because of that uptick in acquisition activity right now around large practices, valuations are high. We have seen some deals done at valuations that translate back to $1 million or even a little bit more on a per provider basis. So wide range here, but gives you an idea of the types of things that could influence the cost. Diving here into the spectrum of support services, so that second bucket of investments. This is a pretty traditional spectrum that I think we're all familiar with, ranging from traditional practice management and business services all the way to medical management and managed care type services. Obviously, advanced APMs and full risk models will require a greater emphasis on services in the managed care type of buckets. The spectrum is pretty familiar. We think it's worth revisiting in the context of MACRA. You know, even if your intent isn't to move all the way to, you know, full capitation type models, for example, we think MACRA is reinforcing that the cost and the quality imperative is quite clear. And so thinking about your current capabilities along the spectrum and the extent to which you may want to advance some of those capabilities and competencies may be important to think about success in environments with even greater cost pressure, consumer dynamics, emphasis on quality, and things like that. Moving to the next slide, thinking a little bit about the cost of investment for those types of services. Again, it really depends on a wide range of factors. So obviously, the types of services you'd like to invest in, how far to the right you'd like to move, and what those gaps are will influence the total cost. The specific services you're investing in and the extent to which those services will be scalable over time. Some of those services do lend themselves to economies of scale, others don't. IT is one that perhaps doesn't allow for as many economies of scale as some of those other buckets. Obviously, the size of the provider network and then the size of the managed population, so total membership. So again, illustrative being the operative word here, showing an illustrative case study based on some work that we've done. This is a high and low scenario of cost for support services translated back to a PMPM basis. The driver here of these scenarios is membership. So the high scenario you see is the lower PMPM cost. That translates to the higher membership. The low scenario with a slightly higher PMPM cost at full ramp up is lower membership. And so you see in year 5 there is a differential on a PMPM basis. Maybe not as much as you would expect, as the delta in membership is pretty significant here, and that lends itself to the fact that, you know, some of these services allow for economies of scale, and some of them, again, like IT, not quite as much. So just an illustrative example here. And so lastly, moving to the last slide in this section, you know, in summary, we think it's really important to think about your objectives, targets, and the potential costs for provider network development and support services as part of the overall financial picture for the cost of MACRA. You want to make sure you don't leave that out of the revenue modeling and the total financial story. With respect to provider alignment, again, think about pluralistic approaches and flexible networks to meet the needs of a very dynamic physician network. And with respect to support services, think about starting by evaluating existing competencies, identifying objectives and goals for where you think you need to be to support your network, identifying those gaps, and then think about buy, build, and partner options to address those gaps. It's not necessarily going to be the case that every organization and every market needs to own the full spectrum of services. As markets evolve and develop these capabilities, there will probably be growing opportunities to partner or buy those services to support your provider networks where appropriate. Okay. So from there, we'll shift to the next section, and I'll turn it back to Jason to talk about downstream costs and implications.
Great, thanks, Nora. So we really wanted to start this discussion with the more direct impacts. So what's the more direct impact on our revenue? What's the more direct impact on our operating expenses, capital budgets? But we really firmly believe that if we don't go beyond that to think about the indirect impacts or the downstream impacts, we're really not taking the appropriate comprehensive view. And the key point within that broader point is this cost of inaction. And you heard Anand say that at the outset of this discussion. And it's not just a strategic concept that we don't put any dollars on. As you know, when we're making investment decisions, the scenario we need to compare our investment scenario against is not today or a true status quo, assuming everything stays exactly as it is today, but rather what is a true inaction scenario. So if we did not act, what would actually happen in the market, and therefore what would happen to us financially? And with MACRA, we think that's a really important thing to consider because we think the cost or risk of inaction could be significant, as illustrated by this case example. And so we're actually going back to that case client that I told you about earlier and using actual data from working with them to really make this point. And as we talk to them, this is really a top-of-mind issue for them because they had some key independents on their medical staff who they were concerned that if they did not make some of the investments that Nora was talking about, that they could lose those key independents to a competitor who was. And so, we ran some numbers on that. And just a single key independent PCP for this organization contributed about $3.5 million to their bottom line based on in- and outpatient contribution. They're also worried about a key orthopod, not surprisingly a larger contribution and significant, almost approaching $6 million. So if these dollars were taken off their financial statements as a result of that redirection of care, clearly that would have a significant impact. And so this is part of what they thought about as they evaluated the market, the physician landscape, and what might happen if they didn't make some of these moves to really compare the investment scenario against the right alternative scenario. And to illustrate the point, we just added the $2.3 million up there. Again, that's the number that most people just think about and are frankly fixated on with respect to MACRA, the 5% Part B bonus. But this shows you that even just single key doctors can dwarf that. And so it's really important to think about that risk of inaction dynamic, especially as it relates to physician alignment and what might occur if some of your competitors really outmaneuver you. So that's really the most important indirect variable to consider, but it's not the only one. And on the next slide, you can see a key point that really must be considered with all things value-based care, but especially MACRA, and that's the concept of demand destruction. So, these days as I talk to CFOs about advanced APM models, ACO models and the like, I think it's understood at this point that if you don't look at demand destruction, so how much of a PMPM reduction comes from reducing our own volumes, that we haven't built a sufficiently comprehensive APM model. So I think that's pretty well understood. But what's not as well understood in our experience is the MIPS side of things. Because it's new and because folks haven't really dug into the math, what many people don't realize is that MIPS could also create similar pressures over time. So what we're showing you with the pie charts are pie charts we showed you in a previous webinar, but we're bringing it back to really underscore the point, which is that resource use component, which really gives physicians an incentives to pay much closer attention to the overall per capita costs and also episode types of costs is actually going to be quite significant over time. So by 2021, you see that it's 30% of the overall score. So as physician understanding of this grows, and as time goes on, and the weight of that score really increases within the overall MIPS purview, we really do believe that overall physician focus on efficiency will grow. And as that occurs, that means that that's going to lead to some demand destruction on the MIPS side as well. So the takeaway here is that with MACRA, regardless of the MIPS side or the value-based side and what that mix is in your market, there is going to be continued pressure on utilization as there's increased focus on removing unnecessary volume from the system. And as we build our financial plans and build our models, it's very important for hospitals and health systems to take that into account. Now, we could do an entire webinar on how to do that and what the likely numbers would be, and so clearly we don't want to do that today. But the bottom bullet just reflects the fact that clearly the impact is going to vary by organization and by a number of variables that you'll want to consider as you incorporate this element into your financial models. So those are really the two key factors that go beyond the direct things that I think most people are focused on, that we really do believe are important to incorporate into a comprehensive MACRA impact analysis. And with that, we really come to the concluding comments in the webinar. We covered our key components, and to really wrap things up and then ultimately leave plenty of time for you all to ask questions, we did want to share a few concluding summary comments with you. The first is that cost of inaction. It really can't be underscored enough because it really is tempting as finance professionals, as we're facing a lot of uncertainty, with uncertainty on both the MIPS side and the advanced APM side, to really stay put and tell ourselves that really not doing anything is the safest path. But hopefully one of your key takeaways from today is that doing nothing and staying put could actually be more risky than actually making investments. And so it's really important to understand that and reflect that in our scenario analysis, to not get doom and gloom, but to realistically assess what that cost of inaction is and make sure that that's embedded in our alternative path and not an unrealistic status quo scenario that keeps everything exactly as it is today. So that's really the key point, and why it's very important to make some of the investments that Nora walked you through for both strategic reasons but also for financial reasons. And as Nora shared, physician acquisition is really going to be unavoidable, as a lot of doctors will continue to seek that given the uncertainty of MACRA. But clearly it's only one approach, and clearly it can't be the only approach, and it shouldn't be. And so we really do think that pluralistic models that include but are not limited to employment are really the right strategy for the vast majority of organizations, and that's the right way to take a cost-effective approach to alignment. And so as you're building out your models, that's important to consider, line items for employment, but also thinking about the investments needed on alignment alternatives that Nora walked you through. And then going beyond the alignment side, Nora also shared with you thoughts on value-based support services. And the key takeaway here is that we think this is important, that systems make the investments necessary to be what we like to call the preferred MACRA partner for docs in the market interested in both MIPS and advanced APMs. And that's really fundamental and critical infrastructure for both your employed docs and those independents to make sure that you succeed, and also are viewed as that preferred partner to make sure that they choose to partner with you as opposed to some of your competitors, and avoid some of that risk of doing nothing that we really talked about throughout the presentation. And then finally, it's our job to focus on dollars and cents here as finance and administrative professionals, but we have to remember the broader strategic imperative here and also our broader missions. And so we can't ignore the fact that while we think these investments are important for the reasons I've just mentioned, it goes beyond that. And it's really about fundamentally what we need to do to deliver high-quality care. That's important for reasons that go well beyond MACRA and the bottom line impact of MACRA. And as you think about some of the other key points that we wanted you to take away from today, there are a few other comments we wanted to share. I think the first one is that as you consider your financial path, as you turn to the next slide, it's going to change over time. And you're going to need to assess whether the MIPS path is right for you, whether the advanced APM path is right for you, and you need to know that that's going to change and the right answer is going to change as the underlying parameters of those models changes over time. You know, Chelsea walked you through some great examples from the tool that show how different things look, you know, year 1 versus year 5, 6 down the road. So this needs to be a dynamic evaluation and a reassessment. We can't just pick a path and go down it and assume it's going to stay the same. So that needs to be built into our process and evaluation as we constantly kind of reassess whether we're on the right path. And when I shared with you some of the illustrative case study results, a key point you heard me make was the general risk-reward profile comparing the advanced APMs and MIPS. And as I said at the time, those were illustrative examples, and we didn't have time to walk through, you know, the dozen different potential advanced APM models. It's really important for you and your organizations to evaluate which of those advanced APMs you're considering and run your numbers through the models through scenarios that really capture the potential that you think could occur for you and your organizations. But generally speaking, there is a greater risk and reward to those advanced APMs, and it's important to understand that and recognize that for those organizations who do have the capabilities and more experience to be confident in their ability to manage downside risk, you know, those models could yield, you know, additional revenue that they could use to offset some of their investments and also make other sorts of financial advantage from getting that additional revenue. But clearly, there's risk involved there, and we need to be very prudent about whether we're truly ready for that. And the demand destruction point is one I just made, but I wanted to underscore where it's really important to understand the impact of that. But a new point that I want to add that's critical is when we think about the demand destruction that could occur, really what that's meaning is that we are becoming more efficient as population health managers, and the PMPM, you know, is going down vis-a-vis what it would be if we weren't managing the population. And so the key thing that really is a bridge between strategy and finance is to translate that greater efficiency into competitive advantage and wrap value-based models, network models, plan design models, and partnerships around that greater efficiency, you know, with things like MA plans and products and all sorts of things for you to consider with managed care strategy and value-based strategy to translate that greater efficiency into a competitive advantage. So it really shouldn't kind of end with the demand destruction, with the recognition that if we're really executing on our strategy effectively and we're in a market that will reward us for some of that behavior, there can and should be some competitive advantage and strategic advantage that translates from that. And it's really important for our teams to capitalize on that as we look to maximize our financial performance. And then finally, as you think about the implications of all of this that we talked about on what you need to be focusing on, there's really no escaping this ongoing cost and quality imperative. So, you know, the need to really optimize your operating cost structure and make it as efficient as humanly possible, you know, looking well beyond traditional, you know, unit-based benchmarking to things like service distribution, clinical variation, and really the entire waterfront are really critical, as is that continued focus on quality, where clearly we've seen on both the APM side and the MIPS side where there's significant dollars tied to our performance there. So a number of key takeaways for finance and other administrative professionals to consider as they develop their financial impact models. But I hope we have appreciation for the fact that, again, it's not just about the dollars and cents. I think this is one of those areas where there truly is a significant amount of integration between the finance and the strategy side, and the need for integrated strategic financial planning is significant. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Anand, who's going to help us wrap things up and turn it over to Q&A.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Chelsea and Nora as well for your presentation here today. As a reminder, a couple of things here. Please feel free to post questions to the attendee interface. We have quite a few questions here, so we'll try to get to a few of them here today. And one other quick reminder, this is the third in our series of webinars on MACRA, but we will also be sending a link to an online self-assessment that will follow this presentation, which will help us help you better prepare for MACRA and understand what you see are some of the key issues and concerns that we might be able to help you out with. And secondly, we'll also kind of help you frame what issues and what your organization's current position is relative to MACRA and value-based care readiness. As Chelsea also mentioned here today, we have the online MIPS calculator, so we encourage you to hop onto our website and play around with that tool as a starting point to understand what some of those implications are relative to the MIPS track. And again, please feel free to email us with the email address you see there at macra@kaufmanhall.com with any particular questions that you may have that we might not have time to answer here today. So with that, we will jump into some of the questions that have started to flow in here. And I'm going to start here maybe with Nora, and I'll jump in after that, Nora. There's a question here about compensation model planning on the physician side and a recognition that some systems have disparate comp models in place for their physicians. And as we think about the movement towards value-based care, there's a question in here about how do we move from the varying compensation models, whether they're RVU or billing-based, to get a standardized approach across the organization.
Yeah, I can speak to that as at a high level, and then in terms of what I've seen, and then we do have colleagues that do comp modeling for a living that have capabilities beyond mine. But at a high level, I would agree something that's tremendously important, even for a lot of the more progressive, both health system with large provider networks, and for some of these large independent multi-specialty practices that I've done a lot of work for over the last couple of years. When you really dig in, a lot of times what you're finding is it's still the case that not more than 5, 10, maybe 15% of compensation is tied to metrics around quality and access and service and things like that. And there is a very clear imperative to start to shift compensation away from production and tie more performance to those metrics. I think those organizations have recognized that the right thing is to move slowly and to engage physician leadership. So there is one fairly progressive regional health system on the West Coast that has started to move in that direction. They have both an employed medical group but a lot of aligned physicians as well. And they really put in I believe it was a year-long process, if not longer, really driven by key physician leaders. And those physician leaders work together to start to shift their compensation tied to quality. I think it was into the 5 to 10% range. That work was really driven by physicians, with physician buy-in and participation, and really communicated to the rest of the medical staff through that physician leadership. And they built a consensus such that those physician leaders felt very strongly about it and were able to take it the distance in a way that was actually pretty surprising and very positive. So something that's really important to think about, and we're seeing a lot of movement in that direction. Again, if you feel like you don't have as much as your compensation as you would like tied to quality, you're not alone. And you know, again, the advice is move thoughtfully and slowly and really engage physician leaders in that process.
Yeah, Nora, I think you made a very critical point here. As you think about any of these changes that your organization will look to employ, having the right physician leadership and engagement and the structures to engage physicians, whether primary care, whether specialists, and whether employed, and your independent aligned physician networks will be absolutely critical to make sure that they are on the same page with you from an education standpoint, from an implementation or design standpoint, and from an execution standpoint, because they will be critical components for leading and implementing some of these changes. So thank you for that response, Nora. The second question, this will be directed to Jason. There was quite a few questions around the math that was displayed around the advanced APMs and the potential losses and the potential gains that were available under those models. So Jason, maybe you can spend a minute here just explaining the Part B aspects and the provider revenue aspects of the advanced APM models with the broader kind of total cost of care or broader benchmarks, as you described it, that flow into what is at risk with the advanced APMs.
Yeah, Anna, to make sure I'm understanding the question, would it make sense for us to go back to like slide 16 and maybe walk through that again? Are there points of are folks not tracking with how the math was done and how the modeling was done? Is it technical questions around that?
Yeah, I think I'll move us back to that slide. I think an explanation on the percentiles of the $46 million revenue relative to the potential losses of $43 million in some of the higher scenarios will be helpful. And then Jason, also a quick explanation on the percentiles that were deployed here again.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so let's take the percentiles first, and then the tie-in with the 46. So the percentiles are from a database of MSSP performance that CMS published. So these are actual ACOs out there, and they published the data on the benchmarks for those ACOs, and then the spending they actually achieved, and then the percentage between the two. So I use an example for the 90th percentile, that 8.4%. So what that 8.4% means is that at the 90th percentile, so the threshold between the top 10% and the bottom 90th, the ACO in the database saved 8.4% versus the benchmark. So if the benchmark was 100 million, they did 8.4% better than that 100 million. So 8.4% less than 100 is roughly 8 million less than 100, or roughly 92 million. So the benchmark hypothetically was 100, they achieved 92, so they're 8.4% less than the benchmark, okay? And so we did the same thing for each of the percentiles that you see from the 75th all the way down to the 10th. And for the advanced APM models, that's the starting point math that you run through the different calculations. You know, for example, on the track 2, what we did with our case example was we said, okay, so for our case, once we get past the illustrative percentiles, we had a $300 million benchmark, right? So basically we said, let's apply that 8.4% to the 300 million, right? And say that instead of the 300 million benchmark, we did about 8.4% better than that, which is, you know, something north of like 270 million. So significant dollars, and then we shared those roughly $25 million, and we flowed them through the percent savings models for the next-gen ACO and then the MSSP track 3 and 2. And the result is what you see on the table. So when you run that performance through the shared savings rate of track 2, what you get is $12 million. The savings rate for track 3 is a little higher, so you get 15 million. And next gen, it goes higher, but the benchmark actually gets adjusted based on some very technical rules within next gen, and so you get the 14 and the 18. So that's how the percentiles are translated to the table. But I heard a question around the 46 million as well, the Part B revenue. And you have to remember that the Part B revenue, the only way that was brought into this table was for the 2.3 million, right? Where if you go down the advanced APM track, you get the 5% bonus on your Part B. So 5% of the 46 million is the 2.3 million, and that's what you see at the bottom of the slide. So the net total impact of the advanced APM path for a snapshot view is the Part B bonus of the 5%, the 2.3, combined with the other revenue impacts that you see on the table. And that's how we came up with the combined impact for the advanced APMs for this illustrative modeling that we did. So hopefully that answers the question that was raised by the audience member on it.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That was a great explanation. So we have time for one final last question, and it's a pretty broad one, but I know it's one that's on top of folks' minds. Obviously, with the change of administrations coming here and new leadership at CMS and potentially at CMMI if that continues, there's some questions around, you know, how folks should plan for some of these particular models and more broadly for value-based care. And Jason, I might direct this one to you, but just have the first initial comment here from myself. You know, a lot of the change, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with any particular program or option under CMMI, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, and some of these advanced APM models. But our perspective around value-based care is that this will not go away. The movement towards cost quality improvement, the cost quality imperative as Nora laid it out, will be critical for all organizations, whether within the Medicare context or the commercial context. So as folks think about the broader strategies, the alignment piece that Nora described, the support services that Nora described as well, those will be critical to developing the capabilities and competencies that we think are absolutely essential to not only, you know, meeting the requirements of these value-based care models in any specific model, but really ultimately improving the quality of care that you deliver in your community. And if you think about the triple aim and what the mission and vision is of your organization, we think that it's critical to be thinking about the strategic and the financial impact within that context, and not necessarily losing sight of the broader implications and the broader transformation and what you're trying to achieve. So with that, maybe Jason, we can add in your last perspective here in closing comments on what you think will be critical about value-based care going forward for these organizations.
Yeah, no, I think you said it really well on it. And as it relates to the uncertainty, it is important for everyone to remember what we said in our at the outset of our last presentation, where MACRA itself is strong bipartisan support. I think the area where there's almost certain to be some adjustment from price and others is on the advanced APMs, in which they emphasize and which they de-emphasize. And so that's clearly something that will be important to monitor. But the overall thrust of value-based care is not going anywhere. And I think the fact that the commercial sector in many areas is really starting to pick up the pace here and take the baton from CMS is really important to think about, as you mentioned, Anand. So we do believe that this shift to value-based care is going to continue. It's always going to be market-specific, and it's really going to continue to be important to analyze your own markets. And some of the political changes we don't think are going to change the fundamental direction of where things are going, though there clearly could be some changes in some aspects of that, particularly in the advanced APM side with Medicare. That'll be important to monitor as the new administration gets into place.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, everyone. We're at the top of the hour here, so I want to thank everyone for joining us here today, and we look forward to connecting with you again as MACRA continues to evolve.